So good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are. And thank you for joining us today for our FutureFeed Explorer Series webinar entitled Understanding Shared Responsibility, CMMC in the Cloud. Today's webinar is being recorded and all attendees will receive an email with a link to the recording. You can enter questions into the Zoom platform and we'll try to answer as many as we can at the end of the presentation. We will send a separate email with answers to any questions we aren't able to get to. And today's webinar is sponsored by FutureFeed and by C3 Integrated Solutions. FutureFeed is the leading cyber GRC platform for the defense industrial base. Like TurboTax, but for CMMC, FutureFeed guides organizations through the entire CMMC journey, from defining scope and addressing NIST 800-171 requirements to managing security controls, policies, and assets to assessment readiness and maintaining continuous compliance. C3 Integrated Solutions is a specialized services provider that designs, implements, and manages IT compliance and cybersecurity solutions purpose-built for the U.S. defense industrial base. The C3 suite minimizes the risk of non-compliance and accelerates compliance timelines, enabling defense contractors to more easily achieve and maintain CMMC Level 2 compliance with confidence. Well, the FutureFeed Explorers webinar series was created to arm defense contractors with the information you need to understand and address the requirements of CMMC. And throughout the series, we'll share critical insights from industry experts and best practices for achieving and sustaining CMMC compliance. Equally important, we'll share the why behind the CMMC program and its requirements. And while the focus of many organizations is on receiving a CMMC certification, the real objective must be ensuring their ability to protect the sensitive information with which they are entrusted and which they create. CMMC can't be approached as a checkbox exercise. It needs to be viewed as a corporate and as an individual responsibility to secure our nation's supply chain from our adversaries. Today's webinar focuses on the topic of responsibility, and specifically, who is responsible for what when your IT includes cloud services. And cloud services or cloud service providers will use the term inherited and will say that a control or a number of controls are inherited. Today we'll double click on the term inheritance and explain what inherited means, what responsibilities your organization retains for a fully or partially inherited control, and clarify that inheritance provided by a cloud service provider may only apply to their cloud service and not to your organization as a whole. Well, my name is Stuart Itkin, and I am CRO and Chief Security Evangelist at FutureFeed. And much of my career has centered on supply chain and vendor risk management and regulatory compliance. I formerly served as a member of the CMMC Standards Working Group and participated in the establishment of the CMMC accreditation body, now the Cyber AB. I'm a founding board member of MSPs for the Protection of Critical Infrastructure and a director of the CMMC Industry Standards Council. And joining me today are Amy Williams and Scott Whitehouse. Amy Williams serves as VP of Compliance and Education at FutureFeed and is a member of the Cyber Guild Advisory Council. Amy is a nationally recognized expert in cybersecurity compliance and brings extensive experience in CMMC assessments and NIST 800-171 implementation, driving clarity, integrity, and excellence across the defense industrial base. Scott Whitehouse is the Vice President of Compliance at C3 Integrated Solutions, where he has helped numerous organizations navigate cybersecurity requirements under the DFARS, CMMC, and export controls. Scott has successfully defended his clients' compliance implementations under multiple high assessments conducted by the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center, better known as the DIBCAC. Scott's passion for cybersecurity drives his work with the Defense Industrial Base. So, Amy and Scott, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Stuart. Happy to be here.
So let's get started. Judy Garland is attributed with the quote, "Behind every cloud is another cloud." And while she may not have been referring to IT at the time, her quote kind of captures both the promise and the complexity of cloud adoption. Organizations today increasingly rely on cloud services to run critical operations, store sensitive data, and collaborate across secure environments. And each cloud layer brings both opportunity and responsibility. So from infrastructure as a service, such as Oracle Cloud Infrastructure or OCI, to platforms as a service, such as AWS, Elastic Beanstalk, and Google App Engine, to software as a service, business applications such as Deltek, CostPoint, GCCM, ServiceNow, and Virtru. Cloud platforms form the IT backbone of much of the defense industrial base. And while cloud enables agility and scalability, it also introduces new dimensions of vulnerability and risk that must be addressed through a thoughtful, ongoing cybersecurity strategy. And understanding how cloud services fit into your security architecture is central to achieving and maintaining compliance with CMMC requirements. And today, we're going to explore how the cloud shapes today's operational landscape and why understanding cloud is essential for protecting controlled, unclassified information and sustaining cyber resilience. So, Scott, because of cloud's role in storing, transmitting, and processing CUI in contractor environments, what special requirements apply to cloud services, and do they themselves need to be CMMC compliant?
Yeah, so there's a fun bit here. The cloud service providers don't actually have to achieve CMMC level 2 compliance, for example, in order to store, process, and transmit CUI. However, they are, if they're going to store, process, transmit customer CUI, have to reach a minimum threshold of FedRAMP moderate or higher, or prove equivalency. So what does that mean? Well, if you're buying a cloud service that is going to store, process, or transmit CUI, it is incumbent upon you as the OSC to ensure that they've met their FedRAMP status. Easy to check, right? Go to the FedRAMP marketplace, look them up, make sure that they're authorized. Now, a big key here is that they're authorized. If they are in progress, that doesn't count. They might be 99% of the way there, but until they're listed as authorized, you can't rely on their FedRAMP compliance in order to show that you inherit controls from them. You can, however, still use them, right? And this is where the equivalency comes in. If they can prove through a body of evidence that they are indeed FedRAMP moderate equivalent, then you can still continue to use them for storing, processing, or transmitting CUI. This becomes a decision for you as an OSC as to how much trust you put into that cloud service provider, their body of evidence, and their willingness to maintain it over the course of time. It's also important to keep in mind there are differences between having a cloud environment and one that's on premises. And so there are a few challenges that come in with that, especially when it comes into trying to define things like logs. With a cloud service, you don't get the opportunity to define logs and log content to the same degree that you do with your on-premises environment. So part of that evaluation process needs to include, how many logs are they going to provide? Are there complications in capturing logs, recording logs, reviewing logs, maintaining logs? All of that goes into your cloud service provider and ensuring that they're going to be fit for purpose for your environment. And you'll notice none of those items touch on the actual business use case that brought you to the cloud service provider to start with.
Okay. So it sounds like, Scott, we're really depending on cloud service providers to do the things they say they're going to do or the things they say they've taken responsibility for. And I think we're going to get into that in a little bit more detail as we get into the discussion this afternoon. So I know, Amy, an advantage of using a cloud service is that responsibility for addressing certain 800.171 controls is handled by the cloud service provider. And can you kind of double click on that and explain what we mean by that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the big picture here, I'm sorry to say, is that you're responsible for ensuring that your organization is meeting all the requirements. So that's the bottom line. You're the one that's getting the assessment. And so whatever tools and processes and third parties you bring in, it's your job to make sure that they are meeting the standard that you have to meet. That's effectively the way you can think about it to make sense of it. There's a lot of acronyms and there are a lot of rules, but if you can kind of keep a general big picture that's common sense about it, then that will really help you in the long run. And I love simple analogies. A long time ago, before I led a C3PAO or worked for FutureFeed or did anything in CMMC, I was a college professor around compliance. And I would have to spend a lot of time talking to the students just about how you write a research paper so that it's not completely plagiarized and that it actually meets the intent of what it is that you were asked to do in the research paper. And in that simple analogy, it's the same thing with CMMC. You can't like just go pick a company off the street and because they say they're CMMC compliant, plug them in and know that they're going to work and everything's going to be okay. It's you have to understand what the control intent is, what the objective intents are, and then you have to make sure that whoever you pick as a third parties meets those requirements. So yes, you can use research from the internet to write a research paper, but in the end, you're writing the paper. Yes, you can use third parties to make certain controls easier, but in the end, you're responsible for ensuring that those companies actually meet the requirements. So if you're counting on a third party to support you in a controller objective, then do your due diligence on them. Make sure that one of the important rules for inheritance, if you're going to inherit a control from a third party, a rule of thumb is that if they haven't had that control verified by a third party, then you can't inherit it. So keep that in mind. Just like Scott mentioned, that if they're going to manage or store your CUI in their environment, then the requirement is that they have FedRAMP assessment or equivalent, and you need validation that that's been done, and not just that the company went through an assessment, but that that particular control was assessed. That's the thing that's really important to keep in mind. I was having a quick chat with my friend Joy Bayland, who gave an example of horror story that she had heard about an MSP who had gotten the CMMC level 2, but they had not disclosed that part of what they stored, where they store CUI, was outsourced to a third party, but in a foreign country. And so then the companies that were depending on that MSP for their services were now no longer compliant because the data from the MSP was outsourced. So it's kind of like when you stand in front of a mirror and hold up a mirror and you see in forever, you have to kind of make sure that you're not only vetting that the company got certified, but when they were certified, that the control that you're dependent on from them is actually meeting the specific requirement for CMMC. The other thing to keep in mind is that if you're outsourcing the control, there are often things that you need to do to ensure that that control is working properly. And we're going to dig into that in a little more detail in a specific example in a minute. But the things that you're responsible for are then the customer responsibility parts of the shared responsibility matrix. So, again, taking it back to the big picture, you can use third parties, make sure that they've gotten certified on the controls that you're inheriting from them, and then make sure that you have a shared responsibility matrix from them and an understanding within that shared responsibility matrix what part you're responsible for, and that's your customer responsibility piece. And again, we'll dig into some specific examples of that in a minute.
Amy, would it be a good idea then for an organization that's looking at a potential cloud service provider to ask that cloud service provider, are there other defense contractors that use that cloud service that have been certified? And would that, it certainly wouldn't prove, but would it give you some minimization of potential risk in using that cloud service?
That would help. Again, the best evidence that you can have is that have the documentation from them that they've been assessed themselves. So if they're managing CUI, then that needs to be FedRAMP moderate. If they're supporting you with specific CMMC controls without managing CUI, then level 2 CMMC is helpful.
Very good. And so, I mean, you talked about the concept of your, mine, and ours, and it makes a lot of sense when we think about cloud services. But so, and you referenced a CRM or a customer responsibility matrix. So, is this how a contractor knows what's theirs, what's the cloud service providers, and which ones they share?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And it's important. Like when I was managing a C3PAO, we'd have clients come to us and say, do you prefer that we put together the shared responsibility matrix, or is it better to come from the third party? The answer is it's always better for it to come from the third party because you're depending on them and they're defining what they're willing to do for you. And they're also defining what your role is within that. And Microsoft is a lot of these examples that I've got here for you today are kind of based off of Microsoft, and Microsoft is really very careful about saying that they're going to own entirely any control that they provide for you. And so the shared responsibility matrix should come from the third party, and the third party should be really clear about this is what we're doing and this is what your responsibility is. And so I just put together a few really simple examples here that might hopefully resonate with the audience. And for data storage, managing CUI, then the third party would be responsible for the physical security of the data centers and the infrastructure where the data is stored. But then your responsibility is going to be around providing access controls and encryption settings for the users that then have access to the data that is then stored in the cloud. So that would be an example of a shared responsibility for data storage. Security monitoring, you might work with a company that provides tools and services that provide monitoring of devices in your network, but then you are responsible for setting up those tools and for monitoring your specific resources and for meeting what you put in your policy statements about how you monitor. So it's not up to the security monitoring tool to say that you check logs at a certain frequency, once a day, once a week, once a month. And but the assessors are going to look at your security monitoring policy to determine whether or not you're actually following it. And so you might be outsourcing a big part of the heavy lift of the technological piece of security monitoring, but there's still a lot of management around the use of that tool and around reading and managing the output that comes from those tools. That's your responsibility in order to say the control is met. Because if you're monitoring stuff and nobody reads it and nobody looks at whether or not there's an anomaly in a log, then that's actually not doing you any good. It's the reading of the logs and the action against the logs that meets the control. Another example is identity management. So you might have third-party tools for access management, but then you have to configure the tools and assign specific user roles. Who's a privileged user? Who's a traditional user? Uh, what are your permissions? What happens when someone's promoted? What happens when someone is fired or just leaves of their own free will? And then the final example is media protection. Third parties might ensure cloud data is encrypted for you when it's at rest, and they might manage your encryption keys for you. But then it's your responsibility to make sure that you've effectively encrypted data on mobile devices, laptops, etc. So hopefully that these give you kind of again, I like big pictures. Like starting with a big picture, go down into details, and come back up to the big picture. And so hopefully this gives you a sense of what shared responsibility is. And then the right column is the customer responsibility. So yeah, you have to own your piece of it. Almost always. There are partially inherited controls and there are fully inherited controls, but you're responsible for your compliance with the framework in the end.
Got it. Very good. So again, while we're dependent on cloud services, we need to also recognize we're responsible for ensuring that they're doing what it is they say that they're going to do, and that they're doing it in a manner that is compliant. So, Scott, we talked earlier, or I know that I did, and mentioned different types of cloud services. And so can you elaborate on the different types of cloud services organizations might use?
Yeah, so there's a couple ways to think of this. On one hand, we may think of this as the services offered by the cloud service provider, whether this is an IaaS, an infrastructure as a service, perhaps a platform as a service, or a software as a service model, right? Difference being for an infrastructure as a service model, you're essentially leasing physical infrastructure. You're going to be responsible most likely for firmware, operating system, applications on up. Most likely the cloud service provider is taking care of maybe some physical security, cabling, that kind of a thing. Your level of responsibility will decrease as you move up that stack to where you get into a SaaS model, and your level of responsibility is greatly decreased because more of it goes back to your cloud service provider. You're not managing physical infrastructure, you're not managing operating systems, you're managing applications. And so you get to shift some of that responsibility around. But as Amy mentioned, it's still your environment. And so your level of responsibility will always remain. The account of responsibility depends on the data that you're storing within that environment and your environment scope. I typically think about the environment as a set of concentric rings. The more rings you have, the more items you have, the harder your assessment is going to be, but also the more responsibility you're going to have. If your environment is solely a Microsoft 365 environment, you have less responsibility than if you have that Microsoft 365 environment, an on-premises data center, another AWS environment, and perhaps CostPoint sitting on the side. You now have 4 different things, you have 4 different rings, and you're going to have more responsibility and more differences just because the clouds will operate slightly different one to another. General concepts remain the same, but the in-practice procedures will vary. Will vary. It also depends on your data classification. There's a question in the chat about security protection assets versus CUI assets. And this is a great question. I'm really glad it was asked. If you have a security protection asset, meaning something that's providing a security function, think of maybe a firewall or antivirus, something to that effect. If it does not store, process, or transmit CUI, then your cloud service provider does not have to maintain a FedRAMP moderate or above authorization. However, if that same security protection asset is going to store, process, and transmit CUI, you need to have that FedRAMP moderate baseline. So there's a little bit of a caveat in there, but it goes back to understanding your data in those concentric rings to identify these are all the systems that I have, and some of those are going to be CUI assets, some of those are going to be security protection assets, and now I need to know about the responsibilities that are responsive to my CUI assets. If they have that FedRAMP moderate baseline, you have to prove that. So saying, hey, they're FedRAMP isn't simply enough. As part of your assessment artifacts, the assessors are going to ask you for that CRM. I've seen folks ask for Appendix J from their FedRAMP package. That is the official one. That'll be mapped against 853. And for those that aren't aware, CMMC 2.0 is mapped against 800-171, which loosely maps into 853. There's some caveats in there, but it's not a one-to-one. So you'll also notice some cloud service providers have offered an addendum or additional guidance. For example, Microsoft has their product placemat. It's not their official CRM, but when you're going through and you're doing preparation, it provides shockingly clear guidance as to what is the customer responsibility and what isn't. If you've read through Appendix J for any type of cloud service provider in the past, it is rather unclear what you actually have to do from one control to another, other than you have to do something. So all this ties back to the type of cloud that you have. So if you're sitting in a cloud environment where you have an infrastructure as a service, you still need to get that SRM. If you're going to have CUI in there, it still needs to have a FedRAMP moderate baseline. You're going to notice in that Appendix J, there's going to be a lot of client responsibility items. However, as you move up that stack and you go into your PaaS and your SaaS type models, the number of client responsibilities are going to decrease. And then you're also going to find that even where there is some responsibility, you may not be taking on the full scope.
And Scott, you mentioned just a case where somebody may have Microsoft, they may have an AWS environment, they may have an on-prem data center. And so when I get a CRM for, let's say, from Microsoft, what it's really saying is that if they're covering things like physical protection, they're really only doing it for that environment. And that doesn't mean I've satisfied that requirement for my on-premises assets or for AWS in that case. Isn't that true?
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so this is where your scope and boundary and identification of your assets becomes so important.
Right.
When that CRM is issued to you, it only applies to the single cloud source for which it is derived. Meaning, if you have one from Microsoft and it is for Azure Government, it only applies to Azure Government. It does not apply to Office 365.
So companies that may make the claim that, gee, we handle 86 of your 110 controls, it needs to be understood that they're doing it for that service only and not necessarily for the entire scope of your CUI boundary. Are there other common myths or misconceptions about cloud services that people should be aware of?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't want to knock on our cloud services because they truly are the backbone, right? As we have been talking about for the last 20 years, right? Everything's going to the cloud. Well, now we're all in the cloud. But there are some general myths about it, and these are really important to call out because it will impact not only your security, but your ability to be compliant with CMMC. And so one of the biggest things that I see is that having a FedRAMP authorized cloud service provider means you're going to be CMMC compliant. And the truth is that's just not the case. Now, you can decrease your risk, you can push some of the responsibilities into the cloud service provider's way, depending on your scope and boundary, but you will have things to do. If you go through an assessment guide, every assessment objective has a verb, and there's only a handful of verbs. Any of them that say define or identify are likely not going to be satisfied by your cloud service provider. That means you got to write it down. They're not writing it for you. Now, some of them come with an external service provider that will provide some sort of services that will help you build compliance documentation. And so that'll get a little bit of a gray line there. But at the core of it, the cloud service provider is not going to cover all of your assessment objectives. So you plan on walking through all 110 controls, all 320 assessment objectives, and going, what are they providing? What do I need to match my compliance? And is it met? And if it's not, or you're unsure, flag it for further research. Another big one is I have that cloud, now I'm secure. And I'm going to pick on GCC High for a moment because this is one that I hear folks say all the time. I just bought GCC High, I'm good to go. I've worked in GCC High for many years. When I first started working in GCC High, you had to submit a support ticket in order to be able to use Intune because it wasn't whitelisted. When you first turn on a GCC High tenant, the only security feature that is in place is a username and a password. So without your configurations, which are your responsibility, you won't meet even basic things such as implementing multi-factor authentication. That requires a configuration. And then you got to identify what kinds of multi-factor authentication you need to use. That, once again, is your responsibility. Every cloud service provider is going to provide some layer of security. GCC High does great when it comes to data residency and ensuring that data remains within the United States. But what it's not going to provide you is all of your CMMC compliance. There are things you'll check off, but once again, that all depends on your scope.
And so, Scott, and with respect to NIST 800-171, are there specific domains that the cloud service providers typically take responsibility for?
Yeah, so there's a few of them that you can most likely point in their direction. For example, physical security. When you have a cloud service provider, chances are you're not monitoring their data center. So things like identifying data, authorized persons, guests, access control mechanisms into the data center, likely going to be on the cloud service provider. Similarly, access controls. This is going to likely be a shared responsibility. They may have some things that they put in place, such as Microsoft will by default put in some password complexity settings. You still need to identify and define if they meet your security requirements. If your system security plan and your policies say you need to have a 12-character password, your default password complexity standards from Microsoft are going to be insufficient because they're going to be an 8-character password. That would be your responsibility to implement. Similar along media protection. If you think about the media protection domain, a lot of it talks about system media removable media, physical media. If you are in a SaaS type environment, you're not managing any kind of system media. That's all based on your cloud service provider. Now, if you have an IaaS type environment, you might have responsibilities there. And this is where you need to go back to your CRM and identify, are they going to destroy system media after it's been replaced? Or is that something that you have to do? Maybe you own the disks. So one of the things we talk to customers about quite frequently is the last thing you want to do is sit down with your assessor. The assessor asks a question, hey, how do you destroy system media? And you say, oh, my cloud service provider does it. And they look at that Appendix J and they're like, no, they don't. They say that's a customer responsibility. You own the disks. Now, not only do you clearly not have a plan or procedure in place because you just said, I don't do it, but you're not going to be able to come back with evidence that shows that you do it because you just said it's on my cloud service provider. And this is where the CRMs feel like a box check activity, but they're so important to go through and read in detail as you're going through that SSP. I touched on earlier your audit and accountability, right? Logs are so important. Most cloud service providers are going to define what content is in them. They're going to hand you logs. They are immutable. You cannot change them however much you might like. It is up to you to determine if what they're providing you is sufficient, and if not, find some way to augment it. Most likely your cloud service provider is not going to do a whole lot here. They're not going to redesign their platform to meet your logging requirements. So take a look if this is an environment that you can adequately secure, or is this something that perhaps you need to look for some additional logging options? Once again, their CRM is going to tell you what they will and will not do, or what's going to be on your responsibility.
So it sounds like an organization understanding and keeping track of its specific responsibilities with respect to partially and fully inherited controls is really important for them not only to be compliant, but to ensure that they're really achieving the security that they're looking for. Amy, how can a cyber GRC tool help an organization keep track of inherited and partially inherited controls, and specifically for them to track the responsibilities that they have as an organization with respect to each of those?
Yeah, and I'm just going to take a second here to say I'm not giving a shameless plug just for FutureFeed because I work here. I just several years ago I developed the basically the advisory service for a company called Blue Boy and looked at 6 or 7 different GRC tools, and far and away FutureFeed was the best one. So I was a fangirl many years ago, and then I moved to being VP of the CMMC program, the C3PAO program at Coal-Fire Federal. And the first thing that I did was, I had a talk with the team about the GRC tools that they were using, and they had one that they loved. And I didn't say a word. I wasn't going to, tip my hand, but I said, well, let's look at a couple of additional ones. Let's look at FutureFeed, and then let's look at another one. And then you all come back and vote on the one that you like the best. And they all loved FutureFeed the most. I mean, it is just the easiest platform in the whole wide world to help a company get compliant. And I say that as a company, as a person who's helped a number of companies get ready. And this approach to how they manage third parties is, also just a really elegant solution. It's just a really elegant solution to what you're looking for. So what the assessors, what our assessment team would do when they were looking for whether or not a company was compliant is not whether or not you are compliant with the 3.10.1, but whether you're compliant with all of those objective statements underneath of the control. So there's 310 objectives within the 320 objectives within the 110 controls. And they're looking to make sure that you're compliant with all those 320 objectives first and foremost. And so FutureFeed makes it really easy to go through and state, is this something that's inherited? Is this an inherited control, or is it a partially inherited control? And you can flag it as you can see, objective A there is shown as partially inherited. If it was fully inherited, then that water drop would be completely full. And then you can add you can add screenshots and evidence of that. So you might have a screenshot of the statement from the third party that states that they are managing that, and that you can include the the certifications that they've been certified to provide those services, and that their services meet the CMMC requirements. And then you can take a screenshot of what they say in their shared responsibility matrix, and and then you can mark that this is partially inherited, and then attach a screenshot of with of course, sensitive information marked out if there is any, or you're concerned about that, but a screenshot of what is being met from them, and then a statement about how you're meeting it. And then you can write a high level elegant statement up there in the summary box that says this control is met by we use this third party for XYZ, and our policies meet the requirements for the customer responsibility on this control. And you tell a compelling story. So you've got a summary statement for the assessors to read. They can see immediately whether or not something is inherited or partially inherited, and they can look at the attachments that you've added to that control. And it's really clear. They either don't, they either get it, or there's something missing in their mind about whether or not you've met a specific control. But if you have those pieces with a GRC tool like FutureFeed that shows this control is met. Here's a summary statement of how this part of the control is partially inherited. Here's a screenshot of why I'm saying that and why it's accurate. Here's a screenshot of the third party's compliance. No questions really for the assessors to ask, other than to verify that all of that information is current and accurate. So it's we found that when we had companies come in for a certification at Coal-Fire that had used FutureFeed independently, that the assessment took significantly less time than other assessments, because of the way that it's all laid out and organized, and how it's just visually easy to see whether or not something's inherited, partially inherited, or completely controlled within your own environment. Was that too much of a commercial? I'm just such a huge fan.
And I think just to add, there is a lot of flexibility for the assessment objective that was partially inherited. That can be double clicked on. It will take you to the control statement that applies specifically, that you've written specifically, that applies to that particular assessment objective, where you can detail essentially the responsibilities that your organization has. And there's even a link then to the CRM that shows, and so somebody can click on that link and directly see the CRM, look at the Appendix J, as Scott had referred to, and so forth. Anything else there, Amy?
No, I think you got it.
Yeah. Okay, well, and I know we've talked a lot about assumed responsibility and inheritance, and we've kind of touched on this, but if there is kind of one big point that we want to make sure that that everybody understands, something that's hugely important for you to know, is that, again, you can delegate responsibility, but you can never delegate accountability. And when you have responsibility, you're assigned to do the work. Responsibility is doing your job. But when you're accountable, you own the outcome and must answer for it. And so accountability is really about owning the result. And so you're the one who is ultimately accountable for each control and for your SPRS score. My cloud service provider told me I was good is not good enough. It's your organization's affirming official whose signature is on your attestations and SPRS and EMAS submissions, and you remain accountable that the responsibilities delegated to your cloud service providers, the jobs that you've given them, have been done right and they've been done compliantly. So again, understand that even though you can say it's been inherited, there are a lot of things that you need to do to make sure that, in fact, that it has been properly executed by your cloud service provider. I don't know, Scott, Amy, anything to add there? Oh,
That's,
Yeah, I think you got it.
okay,
yeah.
well, okay, so I know we've shared a lot of information, and I think we said let's try to make it actionable. And so, what practical steps can a defense contractor take for assuring CMMC compliance in the cloud?
Yeah, so I'll start this one off, and to me, it all starts with your boundary. Identify your assets, classify your assets, and be realistic as to whether or not they're going to store, process, or transmit CUI. This is your left and right turn more often than not. This is what decides whether you have to be FedRAMP or not. And if we're all being honest, something that's FedRAMP is probably going to cost more than something that isn't. So identifying those assets and the type of data and their useful purposes is absolutely step one. You cannot continue without knowing those things. I would then go into information flows, right? How are you going to receive CUI? What are you going to do with your CUI? And then once you've done that, where does it go? Does it stay with you? Does it go to a prime? Does it go to the government? What does it do? Understanding those, once again, identifies whether or not you have a CUI asset, your FedRAMP status, and then you can march that back into your CRM. Amy, do you have any thoughts on items that you would do?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. Just a few concluding remarks that I would suggest is that you always have to check whether a third party is if they're actually storing, processing, or transmitting CUI. And I could not agree with you more, Scott, about number one step is I understand your boundary, and it's this messy, difficult process to go through tracking where CUI actually lives in your organization. You have to make sure that there isn't a rogue cloud that your CUI is in, and that's time consuming because every company is organized differently and identifying how you trace all of that. But once you identify exactly how contracts are being performed within your organization, who's doing the work and where they're storing the information, and then you have to chase down whether or not those cloud environments, if they're storing CUI, then they really must be FedRAMP moderate or equivalent. So that's step one in what you're looking to do. And then even if the third party is not required to be certified under CMMC, your organization must show that you control the contract terms, the flow down requirements, monitoring and documentation related to the third party. So if they're out of scope, you have to show why they're out of scope, in other words. So any third party that comes into the completion of a good or service for the government is it needs to be shown how it's in scope or out of scope, and you need to document that. Consider obtaining evidence or attestation from third parties that they meet FedRAMP moderate or equivalency. What you were talking about earlier, Scott, that's a really key point is get that documentation that proves that they are, and that's something your assessors are going to be asking you about. And then map those third party controls into your SSP and your POAMs. Treat their services as a part of your system boundary because in reality, they are a part of your system boundary. And then when you're selecting a CSP for CUI hosting, a preference has to go to FedRAMP authorized or equivalent. And then finally, make sure that the controls in the third party's environment are vetted accurately. Going back to that story that I was saying earlier, that they might have a certification, but it's up to you to validate that if they're using cloud service, if they're outsourcing some storage, then it's up to you to vet that and to make sure that that's well considered. And then one other thing that I want to add that's not on this slide, I just happened to think of is that we've touched on inheritance. We haven't really made inheritance a key part of this conversation, but inheritance comes from a deep understanding of what the shared responsibility looks like and the customer responsibility looks like. And Corinne Wise, for those of you who know her, she's got a couple of really great YouTube videos that are publicly available that go into a really nice deep dive on inheritance around SRMs and CRMs. So if anybody wants those links, I have them, and you can shoot me an email, and I'll send you those links. They're worth going through because she just does a great job of teaching that stuff.
Yeah.
Yes,
Amy,
yes.
I want to kind of dig in on something you mentioned there, where the shadow IT. This is like in a previous life, this is what kept me up at night.
Mm.
We had software development teams that were all using Jira. And so we said, oh, well, there's this company hosted Jira instance. What I later learned, that was one of 3 instances of Jira. So if you're in a mid-size or larger company and you're trying to find that shadow IT, finance might be your best bet. Nobody wants to pay for these things on their personal credit card and not be reimbursed. So in the old adage of follow the money, following the money can identify those shadow IT items. And you would never believe the things that are being expensed on a monthly basis, because it takes 30 seconds to do an expense report, and that's a lot easier than getting it through the corporate process. So as you're going through that boundary and you're identifying your systems, take a Starbucks gift card to your local accounts payable representative, and ask them if you can get some expense report information. You'll never believe what pops up in those.
Yeah. I think that's really good advice. I mean, I've seen organizations have had instances or had incidents in devices that were shadow IT networks. And again, just absolutely unknown. What a great way to be able to find them, because you just say nobody's going to want to pay for them by themselves. So,
Yeah. We had a rogue Wi-Fi one time entering a secured environment where they didn't get the Wi-Fi reception that they wanted, so they just went out to Best Buy, grabbed an AP, and it became their own Wi-Fi plugged directly into the corporate LAN.
I've
That
heard
stuff
that
happens.
story so many times. People want to be productive. They think they're being nice. They're
Yeah.
trying to move the ball forward. And yeah, that's the kind of thing that deep dive on your boundary really uncovers. It's super important too. So, start with contracts and what contracts come in, what clauses are there, who gets that first, a project manager, an engineer, a designer. So, and then where do they send it and who do they talk to and how many people on the team have access to it? And it's messy and ugly to get that boundary together, but that's really helpful to discovering the things that the assessors are going to find that are going to mean that you're out of compliant.
and, and I think the challenge is that security always creates a little bit of burden, and security is expensive. However, people need to understand that a lack of security can be a lot more
That's
expensive, and
right.
sometimes that's a concept people don't grasp until it's a little bit too late. So, I know we want to move on to some questions, and before that, again, I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and to encourage you to join us for future episodes in the FutureFeed Explorers webinar series. And you can also find the replay of prior episodes on the FutureFeed website. As I mentioned earlier, we will be sending out an email with a link to the replay of this webinar and the slides and answers to any questions that we're not able to get to. Also on the last slide, you'll see my email address, Amy's and Scott's. So if you do have questions after the webinar, if you want to reach out to any of the 3 of us, please feel free to do that. We feel, I think that part of our role is to really help enable, empower, and educate organizations within the DIB. So with that, I know we've got a number of questions. Let me start with the first one. Does an SPA or a security protection asset that is a cloud service need to provide a CRM on the services they provide? And what controls would be on that CRM for a SIEM provider, as an example? Scott, you want to try to
Sure.
start with that one?
Yeah. So if you're holding a SIM, and let's say it doesn't store, process, or transmit CUI, therefore it is a security protection asset. Your cloud service provider does not have to be FedRAMP moderate authorized. However, if you intend on inheriting controls, you have a body of evidence to prove there. Um, Equivalency is an option where if they've been through an audit by a FedRAMP authorized assessor, they can prove that they have met the baseline without going through the full authorizations. If they're not already in the government space, though, those are less common. most organizations don't want to try to implement 853 if they don't have to, because it's lengthy, right, if we're honest.
Yeah.
So doesn't have to be FedRAMP, but if you want to look at inheritance, it might be your best route to go.
Yeah. So a question for Amy, to what extent is information incorporated by a cloud service or another ESP need to be in the and that's in their CRM or their SRM need to be repurposed or represented in the SSP and let's see, I'm trying in the CISs. So let me just kind of maybe try to rephrase that to information that is provided by a cloud service provider. How does that information need to be represented in an OSC's SSP?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So the C3PAO that's going to do your assessment is going to be looking specifically that you have met the objective within the control. So read that carefully and then identify what it is that you're getting from that third party that is either partially or fully meeting that control, and then try to provide a screenshot or a snippet of a policy or a snippet of a promise from that third party that meets that requirement. So it's kind of like, that you got the test questions in front of you. There's 320 test questions, and each one of them, if you got a good C3PAO, they're not going to be going down any rabbit holes. They're just going to be looking to make sure that you've met the intent of the control as presented by the objectives. So read the objective carefully and then identify what evidence you need from the shared responsibility matrix or from any other documentation that relates to the services provided by the third party that will support you in meeting and saying you meet that control because they meet that control. I hope that makes sense.
Good, thank you. And maybe then just to clarify for someone, I know we've touched on this. The question is, do I need to maintain a customer responsibility matrix if the CSP is FedRAMP authorized? And I think it both touches on who's responsible for maintaining and what is the responsibility that the OSC is going to have. Amy, do you want to start on that one?
Sure. I read one of the comments very quickly while we were teeing these up, that someone was saying that often their third parties don't even know what they're talking about when they ask for a CRM. And I feel like that dynamic is changing. We're starting to see more companies be more sophisticated in their language around this and then providing the documentation that they need. It's smart for them to provide the documentation because it helps them get more defense contractors if they're meeting the requirements to say that they're meeting the requirements and how they're meeting the requirements. But that documentation is sometimes lacking even for third parties that are meeting the requirements. And that's when you do need to be creative in how you put that evidence together. And so again, my best advice, if you have a third party, they've been FedRAMP authorized, they don't have a CRM, get creative about the controls that you're inheriting from them and getting the documentation to show that they meet the requirement that you need to meet. And that's going to be, a little more time intensive than if you go with a third party that has a really neat and tidy shared responsibility matrix and a effective customer responsibility column for you to follow. But you have to do what you have to do to get over the line.
Right. And you have to make sure that you have one from every single cloud service provider that you're working with.
Correct.
Cloud service provider asks, what is that when you say, can I have your CRM? Probably not a good cloud service provider to be using.
Yeah. If I could add just something in there, within your SSP, you're afforded the opportunity to reference other documents. So if you have a cloud service provider that has an extensive CRM, there's no reason you can't provide a synopsis of inheritance or synopsis of what's provided by the cloud service provider within your SSP, but reference their CRM for further details, right? So maybe they're responsible for maintaining firmware. See cloud service CRM for details, and then their CRM will specify in more detail any additional items. So you don't have to completely rewrite a CRM throughout your SSP, because that's going to be a lot of work.
Though when you write your control statements for an inherited or partially inherited control, not only saying, that it's the what of, it is inherited from my cloud service provider, but how it is then satisfied by the cloud service provider. And as you say, being able to then link to their CRM for further information. Certainly something can be done, but more information, the clearer, the more concise, the more complete you can be in your control statements. Obviously, the more efficient your assessment is going to go. I have a question. Is FutureFeed compliant if there is CUI and attachments, and would FutureFeed then be part of the list of shared responsibility matrix controls? So to be clear, FutureFeed does not store, process, or transmit CUI. It is a security protection asset. It does store security protection data that is provided by an organization. And as such, it does not have the requirement to be FedRAMP moderate or FedRAMP moderate equivalent. However, we are in the process of completing our FedRAMP moderate equivalency and will be FedRAMP moderate equivalent simply because we feel that it's incumbent on us to provide that level of security for security protection data that we're storing on behalf of our customers. And yes, we do have a customer responsibility matrix that we do make available to all of our clients. So Scott, here's a Microsoft question. Let's see if I can unpack this. Microsoft 365 E5 licenses will ship with Security Copilot. So can the Security Copilot included in 365 E5 be used as part of the customer responsibility portion of CMMC to monitor logs, audits, even act as them autonomously? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so monitoring doesn't say it has to be by a human. So the key note there is part of. So if you think about Control 362 and doing your incident response plan, monitoring the system is one, but then triage and reacting and documenting are going to be your next assessment objectives. Security Copilot, it may satisfy your monitoring, but then what, right? Is it going to alert organizational officials and authorities? What kind of reactive actions is it going to take? Is it going to do containment? Is it going to do eradication? There's definitely work to be done. Biggest thing there is look back at the CRM, and I hate to beat a dead horse on that, but you can't attest that it's performing something if Microsoft hasn't already said that they're doing it. So and Amy, this kind of ties back. I had a little chuckle a moment ago, and you had the anecdote about somebody saying, well, do I write the CRM or just my provider? If you write it and your provider hasn't agreed to it, how does anybody say that they're actually doing those things?
Exactly.
Right? I can't write that Microsoft is going to implement MFA because they said they don't. Right?
That's right.
And so when it comes time to writing your SSP and going through your assessment, you can't attest to your cloud service provider saying and doing something that they've put in writing that is your responsibility.
That's right.
So
100%. That's such a
before
good
writing
note
any of
to
that.
Yeah, that's a great note to leave on.
And so maybe one last question, because I know we're just about at time, but I want to kind of I think emphasize this. The question is, what's the best to acquire a CRM? I feel like most of the cloud providers I speak with have no idea what I'm talking about or don't have an official document. And I would say that a cloud service that is FedRAMP moderate or FedRAMP moderate equivalent will have an SRM, which is the cloud service document that is required that translates into the CRM. And if they don't have one or don't know what it is that you're talking about, probably not the right one to work with. I mean, Scott, Amy, anything to add to that?
Appendix J is part of their FedRAMP package. So if they're FedRAMP moderate authorized, they have to have submitted Appendix J. They may require an NDA, which is their right and completely reasonable. Just keep in mind, if they give you an NDA, you may need to ensure that you're allowed to share that document with your assessor.
Yeah, very good point. Very good point. Amy, anything to add to that?
No,
Uh,
that's
Good one. Thank you.
pretty much sums that.
I think we're, as I said, we're just at time. I did put up the slide that has our email addresses. Please feel free to follow up with any one of us with other questions that you may have. And again, thank you all for joining us today.